Tomatoes, everybody's favorite plant to plant in the garden. They're the quintessential garden plant. They're the summer plant that everybody loves to come out in the garden and pick from, to eat from. It's just such a beautiful plant. But when a lot of gardeners plant their tomatoes, they don't expect the unexpected, which is early blight. It's something that comes in early season, usually within the first couple months of planting your tomatoes, and a lot of gardeners don't know how to combat it, and it ends up killing their tomato plants. So in today's episode, we're going to learn how to properly identify early blight. We're going to learn how to properly control early blight, if not completely prevent it altogether, and we're also going to learn about what it is and why it's so prevalent in so many gardens. Let's go. So the first thing I want to do is talk about what early blight actually is, because once you know what it is, it's a lot easier to combat it and be able to identify it in the garden. Alternaria is early blight. It's a class of soil-borne fungi. That means it's found in the soil. So like I said, Alternaria is a soil-borne fungi. That means it's in the same class of fungi such as powdery mildew and septoria, which is late blight. So if you've ever heard someone say, oh, I have septoria blight, that's late blight, that comes later in the season. That's also a soil-borne fungus. There's powdery mildew, which affects things like tomatoes and your other squash plants, cucurbita crops. That's also a soil-borne fungus. And then you have Alternaria, and Alternaria blight is early blight. Those are interchangeable as well. So if you hear someone say, I have early blight, that means they have Alternaria blight. And they all come from the soil. Now, why do they come in the soil versus other mushrooms? Like, do they actually form mushrooms? The answer is no, they don't. Now, Alternaria blight, powdery mildew, and late blight, septoria, are very advantageous in the way that they spread. And how they spread is they actually use a host plant rather than an elevated mushroom. So a lot of mushrooms will either form on trees or will bloom from things like mulch up from the ground, and they will basically form a cap, and that cap will have gills, which will then spread spores, or like a puffball mushroom will grow its big puffball on top of the soil, and then it will puff its spores into the air, being captured by the wind. However, Alternaria and septoria, as well as powdery mildew, are none of those. What they do is they find a host plant, like a tomato. And Alternaria and septoria are very, very fond of the Solanense family crops. Those are nightshade crops. So things like tomatoes, eggplants, potatoes, peppers, tomatillos or ground cherries. Those are your Solanense crops. And tomatoes are particularly a very favorable host for the early blight. And the reason why is because the leaf structure on them are much thinner and they have a lot of hairs on them. And those hairs allow for the blight spores to land and stick. Now, the reason why they use those tomato plants as a host is because of the height of the tomato plant. So Alternaria blight will actually be found in the soil, and what gardeners will find happen is that in the early spring, when Alternaria blight actually will colonize and start to grow and proliferate, is that they will have an early rain. And oftentimes when they plant their tomato plants, they're small like this, and they're fairly immature. And so the leaves are very close to the soil. And so what happens is, as the plants are being planted in the ground, and let's say you water or you get an early spring rain, the temperature zone is typically right around 38 to 45 degrees. That's the sweet spot for Alternaria blight. And that rain will splash soil onto the leaves, and that soil contains those spores, and that is how it actually will start to travel with the plant. And as the plant grows, it'll then colonize the lower leaves, it'll then spread to the upper leaves, and then once it's up high enough and it can start to spread, that's how it gets spread into the other parts of the soil. So once you kind of know how it can spread in your garden and how your plants get it, it's really about identifying it and then reducing it. Now, there's also ways that you can completely control it as well, because we're going to talk about not only controlling it, but also preventing it. Because once you have it, it's a very simple blight to actually eradicate. It's not nearly as deadly as things like septoria or late blight, which they kind of consider to be the cancer of the garden. It's once you get late blight, it is just, it's game over. It's just about prolonging the life of the tomato plant to get as much as you can. Otherwise, you're basically it's going to succumb to the late blight eventually and be killed off. But early blight is very controllable. And so identifying it, preventing it, those all kind of go hand in hand to having a successful garden when it comes to growing tomatoes. All right, so the first tip to preventing early blight is with the size of the tomato plant you're planting. Now, we got a late start to our garden this year, and our tomato plants are just a little smaller than normal. And that's fine, it's not a problem, but we are going to have a higher chance, a higher probability of encountering early blight, because when the plants are small, the leaves are closer to the soil. Now, you also can contract early blight pretty easily by planting your tomato plant deeper. So even if these plants were taller and I planted my plant deeper in the soil, which is a fine thing, tomatoes can root all along the stem because they're a vine. They can do that, and you can end up really encouraging a lot more root growth, a lot more healthier of a plant by planting it deeper. But if the leaves are closer to the soil, that's their pathway, that's their highway to get up the plant and to start spreading. And so you just got to know that by planting it deeper or by planting a smaller plant, those leaves are closer to the soil. You have a much higher chance of getting early blight. So what you can do is, if you really want to reduce your chances, is by either not burying it deeper, which you are going to sacrifice some root development. You have to know that too. You have to either not plant it deeper, or simply not plant it quite as deep, or let the plant grow up a little bit so that way you can prune some of those lower leaves. You know, if you planted a tomato plant that was, say, a foot tall already, you could prune those first 2-3 sets of leaves. You could plant it deeper and still be elevated enough to where that soil is not really touching those leaves right from the start. As is right now, our leaves are basically touching the soil because our plants are so small. But in a couple weeks, they'll be growing, they'll be off to the races, won't be a problem. And we're going to be doing some of the other steps that we're going to talk about to preventing early blight, which one of those is pruning. All right, the second method to preventing early blight is by pruning your tomato plants. Now, I always recommend waiting for your plant to grow a little bit before you prune, because when these plants are small, obviously you're not really going to have a ton of benefit to pruning them early on. So as the plant starts to grow, I typically will say at about a foot in height is when I start to prune my tomato plants. And we've done lots of videos about how to prune your tomato plants and the benefits of doing such, but one of those benefits is the fact that you're going to reduce the chance of getting early blight. Again, having those leaves close to the soil is its highway to getting on the plant. And so if you take away that highway, you're going to have less of a chance. Now, I will typically, like I said, I'm going to plant my tomato plants. They are small, but as the plant grows, I'm going to wait for it to get to about a foot in height, about this tall, right? So once it's about this tall, I'm going to take first set of leaves, second set of leaves, maybe even a third set of leaves. And then once I've removed those leaves, I won't have to do a whole lot more pruning of the lower leaves because it's going to be off the ground. As that plant grows, it's going to really encourage that airflow. It's going to help dry out any moisture. It's going to help to increase airflow to even prevent things like powdery mildew later on in the season. It's going to even help us prevent things like late blight even way later in the season. Things like, times like August and September, it's going to help prevent our things like late blight. So pruning is always a good thing, but it's especially good even in early season. So once these plants start to grow at about a foot in height is when I'd encourage you guys to come in and prune. Prune all but the first, or the top 2 or 3 sets of leaves. Anything else can go. By the point that that plant is already a foot in height, it's generating so much energy and it's growing so fast that it's really not even going to miss those lower leaves anyways. And the benefit of doing such is way better than leaving them on. All right, the third way to control and even prevent things like early blight is by properly pruning up and staking your tomato plants. Now, we have our stakes in place because at some point the plants will be using staking. So right now they're small and they have no benefit from the stakes being here, but we're preempting that in a couple weeks to maybe a month or so, we're going to be staking up our tomato plants to these stakes here. And the reason why is because getting that airflow is so critical to not only preventing it, but also controlling it. If you do happen to get early blight on your plants, airflow is your best friend because airflow will actually dry out the leaves, and blight is a fungus, and fungus needs damp conditions in order to survive and thrive. And so in the early season, when there's a lot of dew and moisture, there's a lot of rain from just the spring wet season, you're going to have a higher chance of getting early blight. But if those plants can dry out, that early blight can't survive on the leaf surface. So that's kind of a nice benefit. But also, as the plant grows up, we can actually tie it to this stake here, and use a method called single stemming. We do a lot of videos about single stemming, and we'll probably do a lot more, so subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, but we single stem, and that means we actually prune the plant to just a single main growth stem. So it's not a big bush, it's not all crazy, and that further reduces the amount of foliage on the plant. And the less foliage means the more airflow, and that reduces the chance of early blight as well. So we're going to be pruning to a single stem. We're going to be staking them up this stake here, getting them off the ground. That means that they're going to have good airflow. They're going to be well away from the soil, so there's nothing splashing on the leaves. And if stuff does splash on the leaves, it can't colonize because it's drying out really well. So proper plant maintenance is so critical to preventing and controlling early blight. All right, the fourth way to preventing early blight is just by waiting. Now, I know a lot of gardeners get in a yank, you're impatient, and I myself like to plant out as early as possible, but when it comes to tomatoes, what's the rush? If you don't need to plant, if you don't absolutely have to plant, wait a little bit. The reason why is, like I said, that temperature range that the Alternaria blight thrives in, the early blight thrives in, is from about 38 degrees to about 45 degrees. It's a very short window of time. And so, or a very small window of temperature. And so the window that you have to plant doesn't need to be so early. If your nighttime temperature is still dipping into the high 30s, why plant a warm weather vegetable like tomatoes? Just keep them under the grow lights for a little bit, let them go a little bit longer. It's not going to be that detrimental to keep them underneath the grow lights for a little bit. You know, if you're planning to go to the greenhouse and buy your plants, just wait, they'll be fine. The greenhouse will take good care of them, and if anything, they'll be a little bit bigger for you when you go to plant them in your garden. So there's only benefits to waiting. Now, typically here in Michigan, we're planting our tomato plants out early May, mid-May is right about fine for us because our nighttime temperatures are hovering right around that kind of 45-degree range. But if I wanted to wait a little bit longer, waiting a little bit longer would only have a benefit of getting out of that temperature range that hosts the Alternaria blight. So by simply waiting and not being so impatient can not only help prevent things like killing your plants off to an early frost, but also it's just going to help you out preventing early blight. So with varieties like this trophy tomato is just one of many varieties that are resistant to early blight. That means you can plant them in the ground and they don't even blink an eye with early blight. Now, a lot of times you're going to come across hybrids that are kind of born and bred for the early blight resistance. So you're going to be sacrificing, if you go with those, some flavor, some variety, just the uniqueness that you get with heirlooms. But every once in a while you can find a few heirlooms like this trophy tomato that are more resistant to it. Now again, with these preventative methods, it doesn't really have to be resistant because you can actually really control it and keep it at bay pretty easily with any tomato really by following the methods I'm outlining in this video. But finding a variety that's resistant is going to give you that little extra edge to preventing it. Now again, also is selecting varieties that are just better in your area. Certain varieties are going to be more resistant to certain diseases if they're planted in their climate that they actually prefer. For instance, the Marion tomato does really well down south. It loves the hot, humid environments of the south. That's kind of where it was born and raised. But if you plant it up in the north, it will do okay, but it's a little more stressed in the early season. And that stress can actually weaken the plant's immune system, and it can be more susceptible to things like early blight. Doesn't mean it's going to be guaranteed to get it, but if you can reduce the stress by going with varieties that just do better in your area, that's absolutely going to give you a leg up at preventing it as well. So do your research, find varieties that work for you, and if you want to go with specifically resistant varieties, you can do that as well. Just know that your selection is going to be very, very limited. So in the early spring, we'll use baking soda sprays to actually control and even prevent the early blight from taking hold on the tomato plants. The reason why is because what we're doing is we're changing the pH of the leaf surface. Now again, you can use this as a preventative, or you can actually control it if you already have it. It's very, very simple. Everybody has baking soda laying around, and if you don't, it's really inexpensive at the store, which is great. We just take a pump sprayer. To a gallon of water, we'll add about 2 tablespoons of baking soda, a couple drops of Dawn dish soap, and then we'll add about a tablespoon of vegetable oil. And what that does is it allows the solution to coat the leaves better, so it actually will stick to the leaves. Otherwise, the leaves have a tendency to kind of shed that off. So as soon as we plant our plants, what we're doing is we're following up basically once a week, or in the early morning before the heat of the day comes out. We're following up with a baking soda spray in the early season. Shake it up, give it a nice shake, and then we're simply spraying them down once a week for about the first month or so to prevent them from that early blight. Now, if you happen to forget, it's not going to be the end of the world, because again, if you happen to get it, that's when you can start spraying. You can spray them to control it, or you can spray them to prevent it. And all this is going to do is it's going to change the pH of the leaf from about a pH of 7 to about a pH of 5.5. And since tomatoes like a more acidic environment anyways, it's not going to have any effect on them. And if anything, it's going to help them out even a little bit. So all we're doing is we're just changing that pH of the leaf surface. That way the blight, if it does land on the leaves, it can't colonize because it likes a nice neutral pH. And so that's going to help to prevent it and even control it. What we like to do is make sure to spray it till the leaves are dripping and saturated. That makes sure we have really good, a nice good coating on the leaf surface. And then we'll follow up, like I said, in about another week with some more. Now the really nice thing is you can use this on so many plants in the garden, not just tomatoes. You can use this on your potato plants early on. You can use this on things like your squash plants in midsummer with things like powdery mildew. You can use this on your tomato plants in late fall for your late blight. A baking soda spray does wonders in the garden, and we've done lots of videos on it, but that's why I wanted to cover this in this episode as well, because not only does it prevent it, but it also controls it, and we use it for so many different things. So I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you learned something new. If you did, make sure to throw a thumbs up there, subscribe if you haven't already, and let me know in the comments box down below, which method that you prefer, which method you find works best for you to preventing early blight. And as always, this is Luke from the MIgardener channel, reminding you to grow bigger. Take care, guys. Bye.